Hey everybody, we're still going to be rounding to the nearest hundreds today. We already know what our learning targets are. I have those on the screen for you just to review them quickly so that you know what we're learning, why we're learning it, and how we're going to know we've learned it. Today you're going to possibly need your dry erase board so that we can write some things down on there, and you all can give me some information in regards to what 100 we're going to be rounding to today when I ask. So the first task that we're going to have is we're going to be rounding each number to the nearest 100, and we're going to determine how we can see this on the number line. Now, today you're actually going to be putting them on the number line. So we've got to decide where these numbers would fall on the number line to place these dots. So the first one is 89. When we're looking at rounding numbers and we got to visualize where this number would fall on the number line, we've got to also know what the number line's going up by. So if we look at this one from 0 to 100, there's all kinds of numbers in between here. There's no little lines, but we know that it takes 100 hops to get from 0 to 100. So we've got to decide what numbers are between there, and we've all learned how to count to 100. We already know what numbers are between there. So we've got to decide where these numbers are going to fall between all of these hundreds that are on this number line through 1000. So if we're looking at 89, the first question you should ask yourself is what two hundreds is 89 between? So you've got to think about, well, first of all, is it more than 100? If it's not more than 100, then we know, that we're going to be looking somewhere between 0 and 100. At this point, and yesterday I had a student that pointed it out, that in between each number, right smack dab in the middle, is a 50. So in this case, we have 0, a 50 right in the middle, and then 100. Here we have 150, and then 200. 250, 300. So as we look at that, we're going to use that benchmark number to let us know where to place these on the number line. So 89 is going to be the number that we're going to plot first. We already have determined that it's less than 100, so it's going to be somewhere in here. The next question I'm going to ask myself, and I'm asking you, is what what is this number in regards to that benchmark number, that 50? Is it less than 50 or is it greater than 50? If you're counting, you know that 89 is after 50, so it's going to be somewhere on this number line a little past 50. And my dots are a little big, so it's kind of hard to see it, but it's not right in the middle. It's a little closer here. The next number that we're going to do is 433. So if you look at this 4 here, we already know that it's 400. So that kind of gives you an idea of what 200s that it's between. It's between 400 because of this 4 here and 500 because that's the next 100. Now, right between those two is 450. We've got to decide, is 433 greater than 450 or less than 450? So if I'm counting, am I going to say 433 before or after 450? And hopefully you said before. So that means that this particular one is going to land on the number line somewhere before 450. And it's a little hard to get it exactly right, but it's not right in the middle, which is what we want. It's going to be a little closer to 400. The next one is 957. Again, you're going to look at that hundreds place value. There is a 9 in the hundreds place value. So in your mind, you should be thinking, I know that it's already in the 900s, so 900 must be my first 100. The second 100 must be 1,000. So we're going to come down here and we're going to decide, is it going to be before 950 or is it going to be after 950? Well, 957 is definitely after 950. So I'm going to move it a little bit to the right. So it's not right in the middle, but it's going to be close to that middle because it's just a little past 950. So now we're ready to start thinking about how we're going to round these numbers. So if you look at this number line, what 100 would 89 round to? Is it going to round to 0 or is it going to round to 100? So looking at this number line, we can see visually that 89 is going to round to 100 because it's closer to 100. So it's going to round to 100. 433 is closer to 400. It's less than that benchmark 450, so we know that it's going to round to 400. 957 is closer to 1000, and it's past that benchmark number of 950 going to the right, so that means it's going to round to 1000. We're going to do this one more time, but we're going to compare it now to rounding to the nearest 10. I want to know how these comparisons work and which one's going to give us the best estimate if we're looking for the better estimate, rounding to the nearest 100 or rounding to the nearest 10. So in this case, we have a 5, and we know that a 5, if we're putting it on this number line, it's going to be really, really close to 0. Not necessarily right on it, but close, because it's between 0 and 100. 262, again, look at that number in the hundreds place. It is a 2. We know that it's going to be between 200 and 300. We've got to decide, though, is it past that benchmark number of 250? It's just a little bit past. So we're going to place it on the number line a little past the half mark. And then we have 751. Again, look at that hundreds place value. We have a 7, so we know it's going to be between 700 and 800. This one is only 1 past the benchmark, so it's going to be almost right in the middle. Now, if I'm thinking about rounding this to the nearest 100, if I'm looking at a 5, is 5 closer to 0 or is it closer to 100? So we're going to know that that one's going to round, if we're rounding to the nearest 100, we're going to know that 5 rounds to 0. And I'm going to put 100 up here, nearest 100, so that you know that's what we're rounding to. Now let's go on and look at 262. If we're rounding to the nearest 100, it's going to round to 300 because it is closer to 300. It's past that benchmark number, and it's going to round to the nearest, or it's going to round to 300. And then we're going to do the same thing with 751. If we look at that number, it's going to round, because it passed that benchmark by 1, it's going to round to 800. Now we're going to think about rounding to the nearest 10. What's the difference? How does that look? So this number line is not, it's not really visual enough for us to see those 10s. So we're just going to think about those. Because we know numbers, we know how to count, we're going to think about, is 5 going to be nearer to 0 or is it going to be nearer to 10? If we remember that 5 is kind of our benchmark right between 0 and 10, we know that it is a half of 10. So we're going to round that one up because we learned in our song that if it's 5 or more, we raise the score. We go to the next 10. So 5 rounds to 10. We got to think about the 262 in regards to the 6 that's in the tens place. What two tens is 262 between? We know the 2 stays the same. The number that the place value before it stays the same, but we've got to think about just that 62. Is it greater than 50 or less than 50? It's greater, so we know that it's going to round to the next 10. So what is the next 10 after 260? It's going to be 270. But does it round to 270? So how are we going to know that? I think I'm typing well this morning. I think I've got my print too small, and I'm sorry. So it's going to round to the nearest 10, and we've got to look at this number that's in the ones place value. Remember our song says look to the right? So if we're rounding to the nearest 10, does that 2 raise the score, or does it let that 6 rest? So if we're thinking about it, and that 2 is less than 5, it means it's going to let that 6 rest, and we're going to round to 260. Our next number is 751. So we're going to do the same thing. The 7 stays the same because we know that the numbers before the place value, we don't change. So 7 stays the same. We're going to look at that 5 in the tens place. So we're going to decide what two tens it's between. We know it's between 750 and 760. We're going to decide, is it closer to 750 or is it closer to 760? And we know that that 1 in the ones place only makes it 1 away from 750. Now, let's think about which is the better estimate, which is closer to the original numbers. So if we're rounding to the nearest 100, our numbers are a little far away, especially when you're looking at these larger numbers. But when we're looking at rounding to the nearest 10, we see that our numbers are closer to the original number. So when we're thinking about the best estimate, we know that rounding to the nearest 10 is going to be the better estimate. But in most cases, it's going to tell you what to round to. So if we're not looking for the best estimate and you don't get that choice, then you're going to round to whatever place value it says. But if they're giving you a choice to decide which is the better estimate, you're always going to want to choose the one that's closest to the original numbers and decide the place value that you're going to round to that's going to give you the better estimate. So in this case, it's going to be rounding to the nearest 10. Again, we're going to go over and work on our song. If you were in Miss O'Brien's class, Miss Bays' class, you already know the song, you already know the actions to it, so you can go along and do that song with this video. You can click on YouTube to get access to it and practice that song and remember the meaning and how it relates back to our number line. That's so important. We can learn these songs, but if we're not seeing that connection with things we've already learned, and I taught you today in your small group lessons how to visualize what's going on in that song. When we find our place, that's our place value. When we look next door, that's the place value to the right of it. That if it's 5 or more, if that number that's to the right of it's 5 or more, we're going to raise the score. That means we're going to increase to the next 10 or the next 100. But if it's 4 or less, we're going to let it rest, meaning we let it stay the same. We look to the right of that number. All of those numbers that are to the right of it become zeros. And the number that's in front of it, though, will stay the same if you're rounding to the nearest 100. Hope you guys have a great day. Enjoy your day, get your work finished, work hard, and enjoy your evening.